Struggling to communicate with your co-parent? That's why Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger was created. It's a communication tool for all co-parents, but especially those who are in high conflict situations. I always tell co-parents who ask, sign up for Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger as early as possible in your separation and divorce process, because you never know when you're going to need a more robust communication tool that allows you to set boundaries on the communication you have with your co-parent. Are you getting messages that look like War and Peace? It's not a text message. It's the length of a novel. Set the brief chat limitation in the app and keep those messages short and to the point. It's about the kids, right? Keep the focus there. You can also limit the number of messages you receive in a day and other nice a la carte features meant to bring sanity to your life. You deserve that, and your kids do too. Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger in the Apple App Store and soon in the Google Play Store. Go to peacefulparentapp.com for more information.
This week on Peaceful Co-Parenting Podcast.
Some of the topics that have come up over the years are the bedtime and morning routine, homework routine. Technology is the number one complaint, so that is a huge discussion. It's a discussion that you would be having if you were still together. It's a really important discussion that needs to be had, even though you're no longer together. And presenting that united front, even if you don't agree with each other's positions, you still have to figure out a way to respect and support and encourage each other's positions so that you're presenting a united front to the kids and they can't pit one against the other.
Welcome to Peaceful Co-Parenting Podcast, where we discuss strategies and tips to improve your co-parenting situation, especially if it's high conflict. I'm Bianca Balogh, co-parent, mother, and entrepreneur, creator of Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger app, and believer in turning challenging situations into something positive. This week, we're joined by Kari Clemmer, and we're talking about the role of the non-co-parent. In other words, we're talking about the step-parent or the boyfriend or girlfriend, your partner who is not the bio parent, but is hopefully a support to you taking care of your kids. So many situations come up for the non-co-parent that can be tricky, and Kari is here to help us through it and work out some solutions to common issues that come up. You may remember Kari Clemmer from a podcast episode several months back. She has developed a simple but very effective path to accomplish peace in co-parenting called the 4 formula parts that we talked about. Kari is a certified family mediator, co-parenting education instructor, co-parenting coach, and owner of the Mediation Room. She also wrote the Co-Parenting Workshop, a court-approved co-parenting class. Kari, you're back, and I'm so happy to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be back with you talking about something we're both passionate about, and a great topic today for sure.
Yeah, you recently wrote an article for KPC News about the non-parent.
Yes.
And I always read your articles and then I'm like, yes, that's exactly right. I totally agree. So tell us about your article.
So in that article, I wanted to address obviously the non-parent, and I put out the formula parts that you were talking about and that we did in your podcast a few months ago about that's just for the regular parent. This article that you're referring to was on the non-parent and the formula parts for a non-parent, and equally important, by the way. For those, it was just like the other one, 4 that I feel are the most important. There's probably many, many more that I could come up with, but for the getting to a different place for a non-parent, it would be supporting and encouraging healthy co-parenting between their spouse and the ex. 2, obviously never talking bad about the other parent to or in front of the kids. 3, respect any court orders or parenting plans or co-parenting plans that are currently in place. And then 4, this is one I feel that is so, so important. Never do anything that would make the other parent feel threatened by the relationship the non-parent has with the kids. And that's super, super important. And there's probably a fine line that people are going to go, wait a minute. The alternative to that is kind of scary, but I still feel very strongly that a non-parent should never do anything to make the other parent feel threatened by the relationship. That doesn't mean don't foster a relationship with that child. It just means that there are boundaries. As a non-parent, there are boundaries. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, that's a good one. And actually, it kind of makes me think about a question that I have for you that, like, one time I had heard from a stepmom podcast, the advice for the non-co-parent or the non-parent to reach out to the ex-spouse to introduce themselves when the relationship starts getting serious. What do you think about that idea?
I'm not a fan.
No?
No, especially at the onset. A big part of that too is where they are in their co-parenting. That will tell a lot as well. I'm not saying that may not work down the road, but for a couple, and a lot of the couples that I work with have never even put a standard in place or an expectation in place for how they want to co-parent. So now you have this non-parent involved in something that's not even set up, and they're going to reach out. So for me, it's about setting something up first and getting that momentum moving in the right direction, obviously trying to reach a goal of respectful and responsible co-parenting before any of that kind of stuff gets entered into the mix. I don't think it'd be healthy.
Okay. So
usually there's ill feelings, usually there's ill feelings. So you don't know, but I think moving down, once they're to a place of what could be considered respectful and responsible co-parenting, maybe a non-parent reaching out to the parent saying, hey, I like where we are in this, kind of thing would be okay. But in the beginning, I would say no.
Okay. So once the co-parenting is established and there's good, respectful co-parenting happening, and it could be for even a couple of years going on.
Sure.
Then you would say maybe it's okay to go ahead and call up the ex-spouse and introduce yourself and maybe say, hey, I just want you to know that I care for your son and I'm here to support. I'm not here to take over as the mom role. I'm just here to support.
Yeah. And by then, I think that's already pretty much been established. I think, especially if it's been a couple of years, then you already probably know that the non-parent is taking care of your child, that they are treating them okay, that they're not, ugly to them. And so you develop a certain respect for that non-parent if they're doing those things. But at the onset, you don't know. You just have ill feelings about this other person,
Right. Coming in and taking over.
And a lot of that is because of anger and emotion. We talked about that in the last podcast. A lot of that is because of anger and emotion attached to circumstance.
Yeah. It's hard to let that go and just kind of embrace the new situation that's happening.
Yeah.
So you have mentioned, I was calling it the non-co-parent, and you're saying the non-parent essentially. What are we talking about when we say that?
When I'm referring to a non-parent, I am referring to a new significant other, a spouse. But a non-parent can also be a grandparent or aunt and uncle who are actively involved or really involved in a co-parenting dynamic. I have some people that one in particular that I can think of that was ordered to my workshop was a grandparent, and she was a non-parent, but she was a custodial non-parent. So she still was in this dynamic of non-parent, obviously in a different situation because she was custodial, but she had to share visitation and she had to do the co-parenting with one of the parents. Yeah. Anybody that's not a biological parent.
Right. Anyone who's not biologically related. Okay. Because that can be tricky because here you are in this custodial role and you're not a parent, and here you are need to be making decisions. So that can be tricky.
Yeah. And a lot of people that come to me too are sharing custody. So you've got a situation where you have mom and dad or dad and stepmom, and maybe they share 50-50 custody week on, week off. Again, you still have a non-parent involved, but there still is a boundary. Some of that I go over in my workshop, depending on what the scenarios are that come up or the questions that come up. But that's just really important to remember that it does put them in a different position as a custodial non-parent, like what are they to do when something arises? That's why these expectations and standards at the onset of separation or divorce are so important, so that there isn't any misunderstandings about what those expectations are and what their role is.
Yes, that brings me to my question, which is what should a parent who's sharing custody of their children with their former spouse do when they start getting serious with a new love, which is the non-co-parent? So right in the beginning, what's the first step?
I am an absolute firm believer that if an expectation and a standard is put in place from the get-go, those expectations and standards can include introducing a new significant other. By the time people come to me, though, we're already past that. I work with several people who are already remarried, but their co-parenting is in the tank. And so for me, I have to start there, even though they're 5 years in and they've already moved on and both remarried. We're starting fresh with their co-parenting journey because they don't have a standard in place. They want to have one in place. And I love that because there is no room for misunderstanding. And it's really, in all fairness, to the non-parent. If a couple has a standard in place for their co-parenting and an expectation for how they want to co-parent and what is appropriate from the non-parent, then all the non-parent has to do, the job that they have to do is really just support and encourage that plan and not do anything that's going to cross over into something that is considered crossing a boundary or maybe even controversial, It really does boil down to the standard and expectations.
So do you mean by like when you set up standards and expectations that you're defining the role of that, say, non-parent and what they will be doing to support, or more just like they need to do whatever they need to do to support the current plan?
Yeah, I mean, like this couple, for instance, that I'm working with tonight, we're going to start building their co-parenting plan this evening because they don't have one in place. I mean, when you're going through this and you're in the middle of high conflict co-parenting, you don't have respect. Your communication is not respectful. So you start from the very beginning. And the first place we start, because it's the number one breakdown in co-parenting, is communication. So once we establish some kind of expectation for how we're going to communicate to each other, then we can start building this expectation of what we each feel is important in our co-parenting. And that would include a non-parent. Discipline is a big one. What are we going to accept as discipline from a non-parent? Well, if you're sharing 50-50 custody, that's a huge issue. So if you have to put in place no spankings, by all four, no spankings. I have a lot of people that come to me that are under court order not to spank. So that's just taken off the table. We don't even have to worry about that. But you have to have some kind of plan in place for what's acceptable, discipline, style, communication to the kids, haircuts. I mean, something as simple as haircuts. Yeah. And it may not seem really important unless and until something happens. And then your ex or whatever is going to come to you upset about it.
Yeah, this stuff comes up. It's all the little things that can throw you off.
So that's why it's just really important. The communication part of that is just really important.
No, I totally agree. You can avoid so much conflict if you have a situation where you've set up the foundation and you've kind of addressed all these things that could potentially come up. Like, are you actually suggesting that the co-parenting plan include haircuts and discipline?
For couples that I work with, when they're putting their plan in place, if they think that that's something that it needs to be in their co-parenting plan, they can put that in their mediated settlement agreement if they want to be that specific. But I think that it's just a discussion that needs to be had. It's kind of like, and one of the things that I tell a lot of my coaching couples is, if you were still together, the discussions that you would have raising your children while still together don't lose importance because you're no longer together. You have to still have those conversations. They don't just go away. So if y'all would be discussing dad's going to take son to get a haircut, then if mom has son for a weekend, she might want to say, hey, I thought about taking son to get his haircut. Is that something you were planning on doing, versus going and getting a cut and then having an issue?
Right. Talking about it first.
I have to tell you that haircut, that's an issue. Another thing too, ear piercings.
Yes.
I
thought of that when you said haircuts. I'm like, piercings, as they get older, it could be an issue.
Yeah. Okay. So non-parent and let's say dad are going to go and get daughter's ears pierced. Well, where's mom in this mix? Was she going to have a mommy-daughter day? It probably should be communicated, because that is something that a lot of times happens with girls getting their ear pierced. They go and have a mommy-daughter day.
All right. So
that there is no something that happens because it hasn't been discussed. It probably should be discussed. If you still were together, dad would be saying, or mom would be saying, hey, hon, I'm going to go take our daughter to get her ears pierced Saturday. See you later. Bye.
It's hard to imagine, or like each scenario that might come up. When you're coaching with these co-parents, do you have a list of like topics that they might want to consider? I
do in my series, setting things up similar in each home to lessen the confusion for children. That's a nice base start. And it's basically for people, a lot of people who are sharing custody, but it works for everybody, no matter what the visitation schedule is. And, some of the topics that have come up over the years are the bedtime and morning routine, homework routine. Technology is the number one complaint. So that is a huge discussion. it's a discussion that you would be having if you were still together. It's a really important discussion that needs to be had, even though you're no longer together. And presenting that united front, even if you don't agree with each other's positions, you still have to figure out a way to respect and support and encourage each other's positions so that you're presenting a united front to the kids and they can't pit one against the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about communicating with the other co-parent, the ex-spouse? Like, what's the role in communicating with the, say, co-parent for the non-parent? Like, say, like in my situation, I have a significant other and I have the co-parent who's my children's bio dad. What's the role in with my significant other in communicating with a bio dad?
Depends on where you are in the co-parenting dynamic. Like if you're in the middle of something high conflict, having a non-parent communicate to a parent could create issue, could create attitude. And so I'm just not a fan unless the co-parenting dynamic has at least reached a level of respect and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of everybody being actively involved, because it doesn't have to be ugly and malicious, and especially, I mean, usually if somebody has moved on and there's a significant other, they're there for the long haul. So they are an active part. Reiterating to people in my coaching and workshop that the non-parent is an important part of the co-parenting equation, but there is still a boundary. So communicating is one thing, but what that topic is another,
Right. I would totally agree. Like, for instance, in my own situation, like my partner, Steve, he'll watch my kids on Saturdays sometimes because I have to be at work on Saturdays, and that's the exchange day. So he is the one actually exchanging the children to the bio dad. He needs to be able to communicate about like running late or whatever, if they had lunch that day or, but maybe that's where the boundary is. And then anything else.
I think that's healthy, though. I think that's healthy. And I think it's healthy for kids to see that non-parent and bio parent can communicate. That's the biggest thing about all this, too. This is about and for the kids. So if they're seeing, oh, look, my mom and dad are divorced, but, stepdad is communicating with dad, and that's a healthy thing and an okay thing, all the more better co-parenting moving forward.
What about when the non-co-parent takes over, like all the communication with, say, the bio dad, because, say, bio dad's abusive to the bio mom?
Ouch.
Yeah. I mean, didn't you have that scenario in your workshop? That can happen to protect, because if there's some nasty communication going on sometimes.
The first work that I do in my coaching it starts with communication. So unless it is about the kids, if it's anything to do with anything other than the kids, whether it's drop off, pick up, can you get them after school, that kind of thing, it doesn't get a response. And it's only because that is setting a boundary and a standard for what is acceptable communication. So if you have an ex that is communicating to you disrespectfully, but it has nothing to do with the kids, it's just a little extra dig, It doesn't get a response. Only what is about the children gets a response.
Gotcha.
And then in time, that lets the person who's doing the ugly communication, it lets them realize that, oh, okay, this isn't going to get me a response, so I guess I should knock it off.
Right. The silence is the message that it's not acceptable.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But the other thing too, a great teaching tool for that scenario, obviously, is the co-parenting apps, with the communication tools on them. Mm-hmm. People that come to me usually are in a court order to use them. Apps like yours.
Yeah, that can keep track of it and keep it a little bit more peaceful, or just really documented too, just in case you had to go back to court. So
right. Documentation about the communication, especially if it's not related to the kids.
Right. It probably should just be left out.
If it has nothing to do with the kids, then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I have a few examples of scenarios that I was hoping that we could talk through each of them.
Okay.
All right. Here's the scenario. So Bill and Sarah are remarried.
Okay.
Bill is the co-parent. Sarah is the non-parent. Sarah spends a lot of time with Bill's kids, ages 13 and 15. And when they first got together, Bill and Sarah agreed that Bill would be the disciplinarian to his children. What does Sarah do when she finds herself home alone with the kids and discipline needs to occur?
She makes sure that there's been a standard and an expectation put in place before she's put in that situation. She will have to think very creatively about how to discipline when bio dad is not there.
Mm-hmm.
So if it means something as simple as taking away gaming devices or that kind of thing, a phone, some kind of privilege, maybe. Obviously, you want the kids to see them in a parent role, because that she is in a parent role. But if there's a fine line on the discipline thing, this is again why I stress so much a standard and an expectation being put in place about that, so that Sarah, non-parent, is not put in a situation like that. She knows from the get-go, the kids aren't going to question. The kids aren't going to see, oh, she doesn't know what to do with me now because dad's not here. Where if dad and her had a communication, or dad and mom had a communication about what is the expectation for Sarah, should she be put in a position that she needs to discipline. And there's many, many things that she can do. It's just they need to decide what that would be.
Yeah, I'm hearing like communication is really important between the bio parents, but also between the non-parent and the co-parent.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of it really does boil down to, it's not fair to the non-parent if they don't have a standard that they're supposed to meet.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing in place, if bio dad leaves her with the kids, but nothing is in place for her as far as discipline style, that's not fair to her. It's setting her up for failure as a non-parent. And so that's why much of my co-parenting coaching is so much of the communication piece of it, especially for the non-parent, because like I said, a lot of people that come to me have already moved on. There is already a new significant other in the picture. So it's not fair to that new significant other if there's no plan in place and an expectation or standard in place for what they're supposed to do in situations. It's just really important. That communication is really important.
What happens when they can't agree? Like the two co-parents, if they're like, let's say one of them wants to do spankings and the other one thinks that that's not okay. Is there ever a situation where they're doing different things in different households in your world, like when you're working with your clients?
Yes. And that's part of the series, setting things up similar, because it is confusing to the kids if there's two different standards in two different households and two different styles of discipline. I have to tell you, it's very shocking at how many people come to me that are under court order, no spanking. So that's off the table. So thinking creatively about how to discipline. I have several things in a handout packet that I use that helps them with that. Like, here's some tools that you can use versus spanking or even considering spanking.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's helpful as well. But yeah, that's part of that series, that part of that discussion.
Yeah, I could see how it'd be just so helpful to come together to have these discussions and set the stage for moving forward.
And a lot of people won't see the necessity in it, unless they're forced to, like that, being in the middle of high conflict co-parenting and then being court ordered to attend coaching. But then that's where they're like, okay, this all makes sense, and then they can see that the dynamic of their co-parenting might change in short order if they're using some tools or have some tools in place and then put their own plan in place.
Many times I think the two co-parents can kind of go head to head and make it about them. But really what you're saying, what I hear you saying, is that it's about the kids and what's best for them, and that same kind of standard across the two households that's really the best for them.
Yeah.
It's not about the co-parents.
Yeah.
And what their opinion is.
It's called co-parenting, and parents are doing the hard work trying to co-parent with somebody like that's no longer a part of their everyday life, that they may have lost respect for, but it is about and for the kids. And yes, a lot of people lose sight of that. I have to co-parent with my ex. Well, that's who you have children with. And so you need to get it right, and the whole co-parenting and the workshop and coaching that I do, it's co-parent in a way that has the least amount of tension and stress on the kids, that allows them to love all of you without fear, guilt, and disapproval, and co-parent in a way that they don't have to recover from. They can just ask themselves that question: am I co-parenting in a way that's going to lend itself to all of that right there? And if the answer is no, then you just figure out what you have to tweak.
Beautifully said. And maybe easier said than done.
Sure, it is.
It is hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't have the tools in place and they don't know where to begin.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I mean, one of the couples that I'm working with, that from the attorneys thought that it was going to be long-term. I don't think it's going to be long-term. I think they're going to get their stuff worked out in short order and be able to move on with the tools that they need to do this thing for the kids.
Yeah, do this co-parenting thing.
Yeah, do this co-parenting thing.
Cool. All right, so here's another scenario. Okay.
Okay.
So Mark and Jane are also remarried. Jane is the co-parent, and Mark is the supportive new husband. So Jane has been emotionally abused by her ex-husband, Brad, for years.
Jane is the non-parent?
Jane is the co-parent, and Mark is the supportive new husband.
Okay.
And so Jane has been emotionally abused by her ex-husband, Brad, for years, and it continues years later into their co-parent communication. Mark has taken over communicating with Brad to save Jane from having to deal with Brad's continued nastiness. What would your advice to them be?
So my advice to Jane would be to set a standard and an expectation for what is acceptable communication from her ex to her. And that can happen through the co-parenting apps, communication tools. And like I said, not responding to anything that is not child related. Nothing gets a response if it is, like you said, abusive. Those co-parenting apps are amazing tools to help people learn how to communicate again once they've decided to no longer be together. But for somebody who's abusive verbally, then that other parent who's the target of that abuse needs to set a standard and a boundary. And it's empowering for them to set this standard. And it's just like with phone calls, that's another one that gets in the way, not just the abusive language in communication, but phone calls. And, if you say the phone calls can happen no later than 7:45, but X calls at 8:00, you can't let the phone call go through. You can't allow the kids to have that phone call because you've set this standard for 7:45. That's setting a boundary. And then they finally will realize, okay, she means business.
Mm-hmm. And she sticks to it. Right.
Taking charge of what's acceptable.
Yeah. The other parent may not agree to it, but you're saying, so one party.
They don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. You're saying like, you can do it, and without their agreement, you just have to set up your own expectations and boundaries, even if they're not willing to come to the table. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah. I mean, even if you want to give the heads up, hey, this type of communication is bothering me. I'm no longer going to accept this style of communication from you unless it is about our children. Nothing will get a response. And then they have to follow through. That's the only way that they're going to be able to set this standard and change things. As my opinion. Mm-hmm. They might want to talk to a family counselor that might, guide them and direct them. But me as a co-parenting coach, that communication being the number one breakdown in co-parenting, that's where I would start, is setting that boundary. And if it is not child related, it doesn't get a response. If you're going to call me or message me and it's going to be all this hateful, mm-hmm. past history that we share, it doesn't get a response. Uh-huh. I try to talk about the non-parent in a way that they're an important part of this co-parenting equation. So the importance of that can't be, just shoved aside. And I get that. But at the same time, especially if I'm talking to a non-parent, they have to be willing to accept constructive criticism about what I need the co-parents to do. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's hard, Yeah. But if they just let me do this part first, we're going to bring you in, But I think it does boil down to communication and the expectation and the standards put in place. It's not fair. I honestly believe it is not fair not to have that in place for the non-parent. Mm-hmm. And like I said, 9 times out of 10, the couples have already moved on. They've already got a new significant other in the picture, but they have no idea what they're doing in their co-parenting. So the non-parent's not going to know. Mm-hmm. And obviously are going to support and encourage their partner.
Does the non-parent have a say in the co-parenting expectations agreement or whatever?
It's interesting because one of the couples that I'm meeting without the non-parent for the first time. I've been meeting with them and the non-parents. And tonight I'm meeting without the non-parent because I want them to be able to communicate on their own and see what they think are important expectations. I do believe that the non-parent can have a voice once this established standard is in place. I think obviously both people talk to their spouse. So they do get feedback. For some couples, I need them to communicate it first. I don't ever want to feel like a non-parent is getting in the way of effective, respectful, and responsible co-parenting.
Yeah, I would think it will also simplify things, because when you get a lot of people with different opinions, it can be even harder, right?
Mm-hmm. I had a gentleman take my workshop. This has been a few years ago, And he said, I wish we would have been able to take this workshop sooner. He said, everything was going fine until I got remarried. And he said his co-parenting wasn't like perfect and it did have room for improvement, but he said everything was like working until he got remarried. And so non-parent was in the way of them being able to co-parent the way they had before. That communication early on is so important. It's just so important.
Yeah, I totally agree. Getting it done on the forefront makes the most sense for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any other resources other than like, say, your coaching and co-parent classes, any other resources that can help co-parents and their partners navigate like the sometimes complicated situations that arise for them? Anything that you can think of?
Family therapists obviously can help a lot of what I wouldn't be able to. I mean, I have a lot of answers. I don't have all of the answers, but I have a lot of answers. So I do refer people to family therapists if there's a dynamic that I'm, not able to handle. Books. I mean, there's a ton of information out there if they're willing to. Again, a lot of the people that come to me are compelled by authority. So they may not be willing to pick up a book or, go online and Google. They're only with me getting these tools because they were forced to, but they get in there and then they're like, oh, okay, I see. Now this is what we're supposed to be doing. This makes all the sense. So
it sounds like a great first step. And then they could go the route of like looking for books that maybe speak to them or like address their situation. So great.
But that's another reason why I share my personal experience story in my co-parenting journey, because for one, it's so relatable. And so if I'm kickstarting the workshop with something that's extremely relatable, then they're like, oh, okay. And then they see and start using the tools that I'm giving them. All of the tools that I put out in my workshop are tried and true, through been there, done that. And so even as a non-parent, I just think that that's what ends up being really effective and them having somewhat aha moments. My hope and a lot of my work is to get them to see the importance of moving forward.
Yeah, and there is hope because I think you've said like your co-parenting journey wasn't perfect in the beginning and you did the work and then it became a great co-parenting relationship. So people can get there.
They absolutely can. I mean, the formula parts for the co-parents, that's the number one thing. Make a choice. Make a choice to co-parent respectfully and responsibly. And if you can get up every day and make that choice, and acknowledgement is another huge thing in co-parenting. If you're doing something really good, acknowledge it, own it. But if you're doing something that's hindering the efforts for effective, respectful, and responsible co-parenting, you have to own that too. And 9 times out of 10, it is communication. A lot of times it's communication, how somebody's directed. I just got a message this morning from somebody at Facebook. That was her thing. Like, she wanted to communicate to the non-parent about holiday visits. And so we talked about that this morning, and this is just so common.
Is your Facebook group available for just your clients or anyone?
No, anyone. I have a Facebook page called Co-Parenting Basics. It's just a Facebook page that I go on every once in a while. I used to write daily, Monday through Friday, a little helpful blurb. And then when COVID hit, I decided to do little videos. And so I would do little videos of snippets of different things, just like what we're talking about right now. Then people will sometimes pose a question themselves for some help. Maybe somebody that's on that page can help them by, maybe they've had a similar experience or something. But yeah, it's called Co-Parenting Basics. That's the name of my newspaper column as well that you read. Yeah.
Nice. So links to Kari's info and her classes and Facebook page will be in the show notes. And so you normally help parents in person, right, Kari? But you do also do some virtual. Is that right?
Very little virtual. I have some people that are out of state and then some people that are out of county here. I have, within Texas, but farther away, 5 hours is one of them that I'm working with. And so I do Zoom. They don't have to meet me in person. But I do like to meet in person if it's at all possible. Workshop and coaching as well. I like to be in person. It's more effective.
I agree, but I also appreciate you meeting with me virtually today. It's nice to see your face and hear your voice again. Thank you so much. And for bringing your insight and your energy and advice. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Peaceful Co-Parenting Podcast. I hope the time was well spent and you got a lot out of the episode. If so, please rate and review the podcast. I would really appreciate it. If you're interested in sending me a feedback message, asking a question, suggesting a podcast topic or guest, or downloading Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger as a tool for better communication with your co-parent, go to peacefulparentapp.com or see the links in the show notes. Have a great week, and as always, stay peaceful.
This episode of Peaceful Co-Parent was brought to you by the Equal Shared Parenting Program. Do you find that you're ever in need of someone to talk to, like a counselor or a therapist? How about legal advice? If you've looked into it, you know these services can add up financially. That's why the Equal Shared Parenting Program exists, to help parents be their healthiest holistic selves. It's a membership program that offers discounted and free services like behavioral health, free tax prep and advice, and access to financial education and credit counseling, all for the low price of $29.99 a month. Learn more about the Equal Shared Parenting Program by going to equalsharedparentingbenefits.org/PCPM. The PCPM stands for Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger. That's equalsharedparentingbenefits.org/PCPM.